Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. Every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10 o'clock or thereabouts, we talk about some of the things that might affect you in your daily lives relative to some of the things that are happening nationally and internationally from an economic standpoint, from a finance standpoint. It's not a planning show. We don't really get into, what type of investments and, how you should plan your retirement. Although any information of a financial nature that might impact you is always worthwhile from a financial planning standpoint, at least helps a little bit with figuring out what you're going to do. But the purpose of the show is to kind of air out some things that are going on financially or economically at a local level, at a national level, and just talk about them and bring them to light to some degree. We've been talking over the last few shows about a number of different topics, and we're going to continue. Today is going to be, I know it's really exciting as a CPA, we're going to talk about math. So let me just mention, my name is Mark Brackbill. I am a CPA and an ex-banker. And I have been working in the industries for all of my adult life in the financial industry. Have had my own CPA firm for about the last 25 years, and had been fortunate enough to deal in a lot of financial situations, a lot of different economic and financial issues, and it's been not only the educational background, but just the practical experience of being out there. So. It's given me an opportunity to see a lot of things, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners out there have the same kind of background or similar backgrounds. Have had some opportunity. In some cases, maybe not, and maybe this will be something that it might open your eyes a little bit to what's happening with the government, or what's happening with international trade, or some of those issues. We're not. The purpose is not to get into a lot of the weeds on this. I said this morning we were talking about math, and that's kind of half kidding, but it is true. It's the purpose of the show is really just to discuss and to educate both me and anybody else who happens to pick it up, get them to think about something, maybe look something up, read something, so that's the process. So, like I said, my name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a CPA, and that's the perspective I come from. But a lot of what we talk about comes from more of my banking background when I was in that industry, and it was an opportunity to see some of the things that are going on. Bankers deal in finance all the time. Every asset they have is pretty much a financial asset, so they have to deal with the ramifications of economic outcomes and things that happen. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to talk about on the show, is that economics is a science. Some of it is an art, but it is a science. And what that means is that it, like any science, if you have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you get a result. And so it is subject to testing. And that's what makes economics interesting, is that you may want something to be different, but it is not necessarily going to be different. And because as a science, if you do a certain thing, you get a certain outcome every single time. That's the interesting thing about it. Otherwise, you really don't have you really don't have a theorem. You don't really have something you can rely on. And but once you do have that theorem down, once you do have that premise down, and it's been tested and proven, it's going to happen every single time, even if you don't want it to happen, even if you take steps in between to try to make it not happen. And that's what we're seeing right now, is that there are a lot of high-priced economists who are being paid a lot of money to convince the American public right now that what we've done in the past that has failed is somehow going to work this time. That the outcome is going to be different. Now, this the saying about banging your head on the wall and expecting the result to be different each time. It's not going to be. It's basically where we're at with this thing, is that what they're doing right now is printing money. And anytime the government prints money, it's going to create inflation. That's all it is. It's going to create inflation. It's going to create a devalued dollar. They may throw up roadblocks in between so that they can, so that they can hide what's going to happen. Maybe try to divert into some particular area that they have an interest in. But the net effect is uh, they're going to get the answer that they've always gotten and that they will always get. And that is that if you print money, you get inflation. And uh, and that only makes sense because the government has to pay those dollars back, has to pay that debt back. And if they're paying it with today's dollars, that's expensive. If they're paying it with inflated dollars, that's cheap. And the devaluation of the dollar is already taking place because the dollar doesn't buy what it used to buy. When you say devalue, that doesn't necessarily require formal action, although a lot of times once a socialistic government gets out of control, it does require a formal devaluation because, uh, but but as we talked about previously, um, the government doesn't always have to devalue it formally. What they do is bifurcate the currency. In other words, there's two currencies. One that's one that's used at the international level. One that's the one that countries trade. So, for example, uh, in China, in Cuba, for example, and we talked about that. In Cuba, there's the national crook. That's the currency that governments would tend to exchange. It's the currency that businesses in Cuba doing business internationally would potentially exchange, um, and it's set by the Cuban government. Internally, there's the local crook, which is the currency that the people get to buy stuff with. Right. I don't know what it is now. A year ago or two, it was about 5 or 6 of the local crooks for every one national crook. Even though they're supposed to be the same value, they're not, because you can't buy the same things due to inflation and everything else, and the economy that there is, or the lack thereof, in Cuba. uh, there is no there is no value. The currency keeps going down in value, so it takes more and more of them to buy what 3 used to buy, it now takes 6 to buy, and what 6 used to buy, it now takes 12 to buy. So they're running huge inflation, but that's the way that they get rid of that debt. That's the way they tax their people. See, because they're a communist country, so they give everybody everything, uh, but they can't afford to do that unless somebody's paying for it. Since there is no real economic engine in Cuba anymore, there's no incentive, there's no entrepreneurial opportunity in Cuba. There is nothing being generated in the economy to pay for any of this. Their national economy can't support the giveaways that they're doing right now. Now, does that sound familiar? I mean, just add some zeros to it, call it trillions, and you're talking about some of the same kind of problems. It's very, very difficult. Um, if Cuba can offer to pay for things, but if they can't afford to pay for them internationally, if they can't get the goods and services that they need, that their country doesn't produce, and their country doesn't produce a lot, then they're going to end up with shortages, and the supply chain isn't going to work because the countries that are supplying are not going to supply it for free. Cuba was dependent upon other communist countries for a long time to support their economy, and those foreign countries were generally supported by oil and gas, and primarily oil. So that's where that's where the currency came from. That's where the hard currency was. Um, Oil is the hard currency of the world right now. It's the currency that any country will take generally, and that every country has to have. And when you start shifting the value of that currency, or when you lose that currency. So in the United States, if our uh, gas and oil reserves go down or are unable to be tapped or are frozen, then in effect, what happens is we are giving up some of our hard currency. We can sell oil. You can sell oil to anyone. It has a price. The price is set in a world market, and it is determined at that level. Those that have that currency are wealthier than those that don't. And so, to the extent that that currency, now, will that change? Maybe. I don't know. But one of the difficulties with the new Green Deal and the shift to non-carbon based um, uh, oil and gas, non-carbon based items, um, away from oil and gas, is that we are then producing less hard currency. We are producing less product that has value, that has an objective value internationally. There are things that have values internationally, but they're not objective because one country controls them, because they are not needed by a lot of countries, and so therefore they don't have a real value. And that can be money, that can be currency, that can be um, a number of different things that fall in that category. But but oil is the product that tends to be a common currency. It used to be, we talked about the gold and gold standard, and that gold backing that, and gold is one of those products that does have some international value, um, and can be judged internationally. But think about it a minute. We have actually replaced gold with oil as the standard. We don't go to war over gold anymore. We go to war over oil. Um, that kind of gives you an indication of how valuable that currency is internationally, and how independent it is when countries are willing, to basically go to war for it. So that's one of the things to keep in mind here, is that not only are we pumping a lot of debt out backed by dollars, which are now going down in value, but the US's overall worth, its overall value in hard currency, oil, is going down relative to Russia, relative to um, the Middle East, and some of the things that are going there, because we've shut off those sources. So it's it may be there, but if we don't have it and we don't have access to it and we're not using it because we've chosen not to use it, or we've destroyed the ability to pull it out of the ground, or we've limited or eliminated the ability to pull it out of the ground, then in effect, it is not part of our stock. It's not part of something we can trade readily. So oil reserves are very important right now in the world in terms of the value of a country's currency. The dollar in is strong, relatively strong, because of the hard assets that we have in this country. Land, real estate, which is an asset that some countries can't trade, and that can't have. You're not allowed to own. So that, for us, it strengthens our dollar because land has value, and so people will come to the United States to own it, or will invest in the United States to own it, which makes our currency more valuable because of the ability or the desire to own real estate. But the real hard currency is oil. And you can look at, for the last 100 years, um, that's been the focal point of international trade. A lot of that is based on who's got the strongest oil reserves. For a number of years, um, before the fracking, before that released, and where the U.S. was using up and had no new supply, hadn't released any new supply of oil and gas, we were losing value in the world. We were losing our position of strength. We were starting to eat away because we were dependent upon other countries whose wealth had increased uh, comparative to ours because of the fact that they had a larger stock of oil that was readily available for sale. Russia just took a substantial increase and step forward by the recent Biden administration allowing them to complete the pipeline that allows them to feed into Germany. Uh, Now that creates a significant amount of wealth for Russia because they can now move oil reserves that they really couldn't use before, couldn't move before. Now they can move those and get them to a place where they now are a player in that market. And for Germany, it increases because they now have access to it, even though it's not theirs. They have access to it. They have the ability to increase their stocks. So that that whole process, when you look at that, think of that as dollars instead of oil, and it kind of gives you an idea what's happening when they turn off the spigot here in the United States. They're shutting off dollars, and when they allow a foreign country to increase um, their stock of oil, think of that as them stockpiling dollars, that they now have more dollars. We're just giving them dollars. Relatively speaking, if they've increased in their oil stocks and we've decreased in ours, there's been a net change in value. You could just give dollars if you priced something at fair market value. And that's the interesting thing, is that from a government standpoint, we don't really price things at fair market value. And so there's no real reckoning as to when things like when there is a shift in net worth and value. Uh, the whole concept is, if we had to trade dollars, if we had to pay when there was a shift, let's say every time our oil reserves went down or were reduced or were capped and not being used, they're being replaced, right? And so therefore, uh, we have less oil, and our value of our oil goes down collectively because we have less of it. And let's say Iran's goes up, um, or Saudi Arabia or Russia. Just think of that as if we just, I'll give you a good visual. Imagine this jumbo jet, this huge cargo plane unloading dollars like the Obama administration did with Iran. All right. That's exactly what we're doing right now. We're doing the exact same thing, just not with dollars. We're unloading fair value. We're unloading value, and we're giving up value in exchange for less value. And we're giving it to these other countries. We're giving it to Russia. We're giving it to the Middle East, and we're voluntarily doing it. But see, we don't think of it that way because we don't see the shift, because it's not recognized anywhere. But if we had to record that, let's say we had on our government balance sheet, we had recorded the full value of all of our oil reserves. And then all of a sudden we go in and say, we're no longer going to use these. We're not going to create any products in the United States that can use these, and we're not going to allow this to be extracted or exported. So therefore, it's not worth anything. It has no value because we're not going to allow, the government is permanently going to disallow the ability to utilize those oil reserves. If at that point in time we had to then cut a check, we had to issue bonds or do whatever to reflect that value change, it would be a different story. Our balance sheet would go down substantially, or the amount of debt we have would go up, because we would reflect that we're going to have to borrow from one of these oil producing countries that has larger oil stocks than us. Our businesses, our economy is dependent upon it. Even if we can slowly wean off, the world is still dependent upon it. So until the world weans off of it, we have less power, less force. Our dollar is worth less because we can't produce everything for the world. We're too expensive. We're a rich country as it relates to people. We have people who have a very nice standard of living, and but they're not going to be willing to work for the pennies that it would take to be competitive with India or a Pakistan as far as labor is concerned. So we cannot. I mean, it's and I always get, I love it when you hear people say, "Well, we need to produce product in the United States. We're gonna produce product in the United States." Well, 150 years ago, when there wasn't a tremendous amount of international trade, you might be able to get away with that. But right now, we have to sell our products on an international market. We have to be competitive with foreign products. Otherwise, foreign products will come in and take ours over. We could restrict that. We can create tariffs. We could restrict that freedom of trade. But when we do that, when we restrict that trade, it's going to result in our country and the people in our country in particular being poor, not wealthier, poor. So there's a significant cost, and and most people will not do that. They're going to gravitate. They're not going to give up their standard of living. They're not going to give up their income for uh, for a reduction in in value there. And unfortunately, that's kind of what's going to happen. It's if the U.S. produced all the products we needed here, uh, you would have to we would have to get income. It would there's a finite amount of income in our economy. Our economy produces a finite amount of goods and services. That's what we can spend. If the amount that we can produce of GNP and product, if that goes down because we can't sell our product internationally because it's too expensive, or we don't have products that we can sell internationally competitively, uh, then our standard of living is going to go down. That's just the way it is because it's going to our gross national product is going to go down. We're going to have less money to spend on our own population, and therefore people will become poor. And that's just logical. I mean, it is. If you look at don't look at the short run. You can talk about all of the short run things. Trump used to talk about the tariffs, and in the short run, he had a purpose for that. But in the long run, that's not a good philosophy because protecting U.S. jobs at the expense of international competition is not a good thing. We are not the sole power in the world anymore. We can't dictate price, particularly since the world has become a service economy. It used to be that the world was more of a product economy. But right now, the world is a service economy, and you can purchase labor anywhere. It's amazing. A number of years ago, a lot of people in my industry, in the CPA industry, we were looking at, oh well, we need to find a cheaper source of labor to prepare tax returns. Nobody wants to pay for a tax return because it's a cost to them, and they hate that they have to do it anyway. And besides that, they have to pay taxes. So everybody's looking for less cost, and then on the flip side, it becomes more and more expensive to get a college degree, to become educated in tax, to be a CPA, and to keep up your education and all of those kind of things. So you're spending, you as a CPA are spending thousands and thousands of dollars, which increases the cost of the tax return, and the consumer doesn't want to pay it. So first of all, they look to go someplace else where they think that they get the same thing. So they look to go to a lower quality product is really what they're doing. They don't really realize it because they say, well, they're filing my tax return. It went through. It must be okay. Well, that's not the case. But but it's a lower quality product. It's, H&R Block or uh, Jackson Hewitt. They're a retail production operation. They're a lower cost, they're a lower cost product, and thus they don't have the trained personnel. Interestingly enough, a lot of businesses, including the big CPA firms, and and this goes to show you where they're at internationally, because they have to compete internationally. The big CPA firms they outsourced their labor. They didn't outsource it, they kept it actually within the firm. But they moved their labor on tax returns, on individual tax returns, to their offices in India. Now, I, as a CPA locally, don't have an office in India. I can go hire somebody I can go hire a group of people, a group of accountants and tax preparers and CPAs who are working, who have people in India, who have offices and people in India. I could hire them and I can use them. But the government stopped. They wanted to stop that. They stopped that basically back 10 years ago. They tried to put a roadblock up on that, to make it difficult for us to do that. But you see, the thing is, the big firms, they still did it. They could do it. All they did was say, the local guy, you can't do it. So we became uncompetitive with the big CPA firms, and we had better talent actually preparing the returns in most cases. But but they were able to outsource that, and their labor in India was, 30 cents an hour or so. So but it wasn't illegal for them to do that. They didn't have disclosure requirements because they were not outsourcing it to another firm in India. They were outsourcing it to their own firm. It was an insource to their own firm in India. So, but the point being is that we can outsource labor now, and that's becoming more and more prevalent. It's being replaced by artificial intelligence. It's being replaced with labor in India and Pakistan. There's huge industries in other countries of just providing labor to the United States. Huge industries doing that, and that's not going away. These are high-paying jobs in India and Pakistan. These are jobs that everybody strives for. They're Western jobs. They're jobs where you're being paid very, very well. Once years ago, somebody said to me, "Yeah, well, how do you know they're not gonna? How do you know they're not gonna, steal your identity?" And and they had a whole legitimate reason why that's not happening, and it wasn't happening and doesn't happen, because they have all these controls in place to stop that from happening. But but the actual answer is, this would be these jobs over there are the equivalent of what some of the wealthier people in the country are making from a payment standpoint. The people that own these firms, the people that work in these firms, they're making the equivalent of doctors and lawyers and government people make in their own country. They're at that level. Why would you risk that for a couple bucks that is nowhere near what you're making on an ongoing basis? That would be like saying, well, I went to my doctor the other day. How do I know he's not taking my social security number, because he's got access to it, and selling it to somebody? Well, my doctor, he probably, hopefully, doesn't need to sell my social security number to somebody. So I don't think he's going to do it. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about people that are paid equivalent to a doctor here in the United States. And I'm not talking about the people that are managing. I'm talking about the people that are actually working, are making such good money that they would not jeopardize that. Plus, you're dealing in a Western economy, which they want to do, and so anyway, it's an interesting process. But the point being that that we have outsourced and can outsource, and the world is outsourcing labor and artificial intelligence, but labor to the lowest priced product, the lowest denominator, and that's where that's what happens in a pretty much capitalistic system, a free market system, and that's generally what we have in the world right now, because nobody controls all of it. And so it's kind of funny. We have communist countries that are forced to deal internationally in a free market type of system, uh, because it is not controlled by any one power at this point yet. Off and on, countries have had more power than others because their oil reserves have gone up, and the stock of oil has gone up, and that's given them more power. Uh, Countries like China and India uh, have gone through stages where they've increased in power and in the economy because of cheap labor, because of their resource, which is labor, cheap labor. But it's just it's continuing, and but it continues to kind of bounce around as long as that stays that way, and no one country takes control, or no one group takes control, like the United Nations, like the G20. you know that is that whole concept is absolutely against the whole concept of free enterprise. I don't know why we even participate in something like that. Why would we, as a free market capitalistic system, participate in a collective operation that whose sole purpose is to dictate and control the economies of other countries, including our own. I just don't understand why we would agree to that, why we would allow ourselves to be pulled out and then covered by restrictions that nobody else is covered by, or that others aren't covered to the same extent. I can't, and give up that opportunity. I don't know, but anyway. So speaking of all of that, we've got a budget bill out there. It still is not available for anybody to see. I mean, I've been talking about this for a few weeks now, and I'm gonna talk about it, because I want you to focus on this, because there are very few people that are focusing on it, and I have heard a collective sigh of relief from some people on the right, because they think that this thing has gone from 6 trillion to 3 trillion, and now that it's down to 1.9 trillion, there's this collective sigh of relief that we've kind of controlled it. That sigh of relief should be a gasp. It should be a gasp of disbelief, because I'm telling you, it didn't go away. It didn't get scaled back. So what we're going to do, because I know many of us have not had this opportunity in the past, um, we're going to do some government math. Now, some of you had new math when you were. I remember when I was in school, like, I learned new math. I learned a new way to divide. So some of you have had new math, some of you have had old math, some of you cipher. But I'm going to teach you government math, because government math is amazing. If you know government math, you can do anything. You can accomplish anything, because government math is amazing. So let's start with a basic example of government math. All right. So I'm going to pay you $1,000 a week for a year. And I'm going to do that for 10 years, right? I'm going to do that for 10 years. So that's $520,000. So I'm going to pay you $520 over 10 years at $1,000 a week. So that's my number, right? Well, that number's too high. So now I'm going to pay you $1,000 a week, and I'm only going to pay it over 5 years. At the end of 5 years, I'm going to stop it, and we're going to vote. Here's the key. Here's the key to government math. I'm going to stop it under this budget bill, and we'll vote again in 5 years to decide whether we're going to continue. All right. So now Under government math, that's $260,000. That's not $520,000. It's not 10 years. It's $260,000 because it's only 5 years. So that only cost us $260,000, right? Well, wait a minute. So now that's too high. 260,000 is too high. So at this point, I need to reduce that. I need to cut that in half. I need to take that from, I'm taking it from 260 to 130. I'm going to cut that in half, right? All right. Well, so instead of 5 years of $1,000 a week, I'm only going to do 2.5 years, and then we're going to vote on it again at the end of 2.5 years. All right. So in a vacuum, that appears under government math calculations, that appears that I have reduced my cost, that I have reduced the numbers, right? So I've actually reduced my budget from 520 to 260 to 130. Now my budget is 130. Okay. But is it? I didn't really cut anything out, right? I didn't change anything because I didn't pass something that says you can't increase this at the end of 5 years, or you can't increase this at the end of 2.5 years. I said, well, you're just going to have to vote on it. You're going to have to vote again. We're just not going to guarantee it beyond that period of time. It might come back up again. We're not saying we won't bring it back up again, depending upon what's going on, but we're not going to definitely cancel it. So therefore, under government math, I've reduced my number. I've gone from 6 trillion to 3 trillion, now down to to almost 2 trillion, less than 2 trillion. So I've reduced the number. But did I really? Because what's going to happen at the end of 2.5 years? What's going to happen at the end of 5 years? Are the people in this country going to vote, yes, I'll give away my $1,000 a week? They're spending that $1,000 a week now. For 2.5 years, they've had $1,000 a week that's coming into them that they can use for whatever they want, food, support for their family, whatever they're using it for. Are they going to vote against that? Are they going to vote to change that? I don't think so. That's government math. Government math is amazing. If you know how to use it, it's amazing. So when you're looking at this bill that's going through, nothing has been eliminated. They have not eliminated anything. People say it went from 6 trillion to 2 trillion. They had to eliminate something. They did not eliminate any programs. They're all still there. That's why they don't want you to see them. They're all still there. They're just stopped in this budget. They're just stopped earlier. That's it. Because they know once it's started, it's never going to be stopped. Once you give people stuff, you don't take it away. Just doesn't happen. All right. Just like government math. I love government math when they say we're going to reduce the budget by 3%. We're going to reduce the budget by 10%. Now, you and I would think, well, if I got $1 trillion budget and I'm going to reduce it by 10%, my budget's now $900 billion. Wow. I've cut $100 billion out of my budget. No. Wait a minute. That's not how the government cuts your budget. When the government says they're cutting your budget 10%, they mean that they're cutting the growth in the budget by 10%. So what that means is if the budget was scheduled to go from 1 trillion to 1.2 trillion, they're going to cut they're going to cut 120 billion out of that is what they're going to do out of that increase. So instead of the 2 trillion, they're cutting out, it's only going up 90% of that, 1.8 trillion. So there's, 0.2 of a trillion, 200 billion that's getting cut out of that. That's how they calculate government math. So they didn't really cut anything. And that's how this is why you have to look at this budget, because that's the same logic in this budget that they use for everything else. They're not cutting any programs. They're just recalculating how long they think they need it to last before it becomes permanent. And that's exactly what. And the argument right now is not about what they're reducing. It's about how long they think that they have to go before people will demand that it continue. So that's different for free education, for example, than it is for than it is for a universal income payment, like the earned income tax credit. Those are different things. If you start giving people 1,000 or 1,500 a month on a regular basis, I guarantee you 2 years down the road, that's going to be ingrained in their budget. That's never coming out. Those people they'll go to the polls and elect whoever says we're going to keep this $1,500 a month. That's just going to happen. On the other hand, other things take a little longer. Education may be something that you can't, you can't do right away. People aren't going to get ingrained because it takes time for people to get old enough to go to college, and not everybody has people in college. So there are less people that affect. So therefore, that probably is going to have to would have to stay in place longer as a subsidy for people to buy into it. That's why Bernie's so big on on that staying in the program and staying in there longer. That's why he doesn't want to cut that out, because he knows it's going to take longer for that to get ingrained in the population, so that they will not vote to get rid of it. If I don't have a kid going to college, and I don't have one in the near term going to college, I'm not going to run out and vote to continue to give them free college necessarily. But if, on the other hand, I've got a kid that has a college education, and they would have to pay for it and they would have to pay the debt off if they don't vote to continue it, you can bet that I'm going to go out, and they're going to go out and vote to continue that free education. So what's happening now in this bill is all about how long we have to leave something in before it can't be taken out any longer. And that's why things are changing. One of the big pushes right now is to have Medicare expanded to include hearing aids and dental work, right? Well, that is one that probably wouldn't need to be very long, because we have a lot of people on Medicare already. They vote, and once they realize that they can get what was a $2,000 hearing aid, which is now going to be a $10,000 hearing aid because the government's paying for it. Once they find out that they can get a $10,000 hearing aid and it's not going to cost them anything, or they can get those dental implants that they couldn't afford before, or they can get extended cataract surgery or whatever, you can bet that they're not going to vote against that a couple years down the road when it's scheduled to roll out. So this budget bill has been very easy to scale down because you don't have to cut anything. You don't have to eliminate any programs. All they have to do is reduce the period of time that they're going to count. But they don't want them to go away. These things they want to be permanent. So the number, like I said, wasn't $520,000 like I originally used in my example over 10 years. The reality is that number is 520,000 multiple times, because once these programs are in the system, they never go away. You think Medicare is going away? Is Social Security going away? None of that is going away. Do you think when it was proposed initially, it was proposed at the level that it's at now, and it was designed to be permanent? Absolutely not. But why was it done that way? Well, because government, using government math, was smart enough to realize that once you give people a taste of something, once you get them hooked on the drug, you can pretty much charge them whatever you want. You can do whatever you want, because they're not going to go away. When you start cutting off the drug, they're going to want that back. They're addicted at that point. And that's what government's about right now. That's what this budget bill is about. It is about addiction. It is about getting the population addicted to these social payments so that they will never change. And that's how socialism occurs. Socialism doesn't occur by a mass election of socialists to government. That's not what happens. Socialism creeps in the back door. And as I've said many, many, many times before, we've allowed that to happen through the tax code, and that's going to continue. So socialism is coming through the back door. You're not seeing any of the stuff that's proposed because they do not want you to see it, because they don't want you to see what's actually in there. They just want you to focus on the number because they're going to keep that in there. And they know people will object because they'll realize that something like that is going to be very expensive in the long run, but they don't care. They don't want you to see it. You won't see it. This bill will get voted on in the dark of night, and it will go through, and it will be another health care bill. It will be, you got to pass it to see what it says. And that's exactly what the Democrats are doing right now with this bill. Nobody's focusing on the Green Book that was prepared in May. Nobody's looking at those numbers coming out of the president. All of this detail is hidden. Nobody is seeing the detail of the bill. They're only letting you see the things that they want you to see to get their point across, to get what they need to get done. And most of that is showing what they're eliminating, but they're not eliminating anything. They're just reducing the period of time. So keep in mind, this is government math. So when you look at it, and this is a great thing to do in a lot of different areas, like at home, for example, I could say, I need to trim my budget a little bit around here. My budget's a little, I could use something. So you know what? I know I got a 30-year mortgage, but I'm only going to make my payment for the next 2 years, and then I'm going to stop making my payment after that. So I don't really need a budget for that anymore because, it's not really in my budget anymore. I won't need that money because I'm going to stop making that payment. Well, that's government math. So, those of you that were using the new math, you need to switch over to government math. This is really good stuff. So take a look at the bill. Take a look at what they're doing. You'll never see it. You won't see it until it's passed. But keep an eye on it because it is dangerous. Anyway, thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. Thanks for being here with us on Wednesdays, 9 to 10 o'clock. Every Wednesday morning, we talk about some of the things that are going on in the world that maybe need to be talked about. So join us. We'll be here next Wednesday right on WSTU Digital 1450, Martin County's Heritage Station.